The prairie wind carried more than just dust that day. It carried the sound of a woman's quiet sobs. A mail-order bride left at the gate like unwanted cargo, her suitcase sitting heavier than her broken heart. No one came back for her. No one cared that the sun was sinking and the night would be merciless. But someone was watching. A cowboy from the neighboring ranch, a man who had known loneliness in his own skin, saw what others chose to ignore. He saw the way her hands trembled as she tried to hide her tears, and he heard the silence of a soul that had been told too many times it was not worth keeping. That's where most stories would end, with rejection, with shame, with another soul cast aside by a world too cruel to make space for tenderness. But this one did not end there. For as she stood abandoned, he stepped forward. He didn't speak with pity. He didn't treat her like a burden. Instead, he simply said words she had longed her entire life to hear: "You don't have to face this alone." What she didn't know was that this moment at the gate would be the beginning of something she had thought impossible: a second chance at love, dignity, and belonging. And yet every heart that has been broken carries scars. Could she truly trust again after such betrayal? Could he hold on when her fears pushed him away? Stay with us until the end, because hidden in this quiet tale of the West is a truth rarely told: how one man's choice to see her, not her scars, not her past, but her, would change both their lives forever. June in the far west was hot enough that even the shadows seemed to pant. The wind carried dust across the plains, streaking the earth with scars. At the end of the dirt road, a ranch gate stood half open. Beside a battered wagon, a woman stood very still, as though the whole world had just pushed her aside. In her hand, she clutched a worn leather valise, and her name was Clara. She had traveled 4 long days trained to coach, to wagon crossing towns of tin roofs and sun-bleached fields. At 50 years old, Clara carried more than luggage: a forced marriage, years of neglect, and words that had cut deeper than any blade. Answering a mail-order ad from a rancher in Montana was not a dream for her. It was a last hope for a roof, for quiet, for a chair by a fire where she might breathe without being scolded for breathing too loud. The man had promised to meet her at the gate by noon, but the sun was already sinking toward the west, and the gate cast a long, accusing shadow. On the wagon seat lay a folded note. Clara opened it, her fingers trembling. The message was blunt, cold: "Change my mind. Don't need you. Go back. Go back where?" The road behind her stretched like a threat. At her age, going back meant returning to silence and sidelong glances, to being invisible in her own family. She stood taller, drawing the valise to her chest. She had come too far to retreat. But what waited ahead? Hoofbeats echoed from the neighboring ranch, slow, steady, like a heartbeat settling. A tall man approached on horseback, shoulders broad, hat brim shading his eyes. He stopped at a respectful distance, dust circling the horse's hooves like a halo. "Hot afternoon," he said, his voice deep and calm. "Looking for someone." "Someone," Clara replied, holding out the paper. "But it seems he doesn't want me." The man read the note, jaw tightening, but his eyes stayed gentle. "This isn't your fault." "In my life," she murmured with a weary smile, "it rarely is. Yet somehow I always end up carrying it." He nodded as though he understood burdens that had no proper name. "I'm Thomas. My ranch is just next door. Sun'll be gone soon. You can't stay out here all night." "You don't know who I am," said Clara softly, "and I've nothing to offer in return." "No return needed," Thomas answered, dismounting. "House isn't big, but it has a roof, a table, and hot tea. Come rest. Tomorrow we'll see." For a long breath, Clara studied him. He didn't look like a man trying to play savior, only a tree standing firm in the wind. She gave the faintest nod. "Thank you, Thomas." He lifted her valise as if it weighed nothing. His hand calloused from rope, and wood brushed hers, surprisingly gentle, as though touching something fragile. They walked together beneath the fading light, their shadows long and parallel on the ground, like 2 lines written late onto the wide page of the plains. The ranch came into view beyond birch trees: a whitewashed cabin, a red barn, a lonely windmill. The air smelled of hay, saddle leather, and wood smoke, fragrance of a life both rugged and steady. "Go on in," Thomas said, opening the door. "Living room's to the right, kitchen straight ahead. You can take the front room. The door locks. No one enters unless you wish it." Clara paused on the threshold. Inside was simple, orderly, solid wooden table. 2 chairs, a black iron stove, and a hand-stitched cloth folded neatly on the shelf. It felt less like a house than a companion who'd been kept with respect. She laid her palm on the smooth table, cool like water, in a well. "It's been a long time since I touched anything I was allowed to call my own," she whispered. "Here you're allowed," said Thomas. "Would you like tea?" He built the fire with quiet efficiency. Sparks leapt and warmth spread. Clara sat upright, hands resting protectively on her valise. The firelight flickered across her face, softening the fatigue etched by miles of road. "Do you wish to speak of why you came so far?" Thomas asked, setting a steaming cup before her. "Not tonight," she answered, lifting the cup to her lips. The scent of mint opened her chest. "Tonight I'd rather forget who I am. Sometimes forgetting is mercy," he said, lowering himself into the opposite chair. The clock ticked steadily. Outside, the wind moaned against the eaves like a distant cello. For the first time in many months, Clara felt her heart slow, not from despair, but from calm. She slipped off her gloves, revealing hands marked with fine scars and calluses, the secret calendar of her life. "You'll want to wash the dust off," Thomas suggested. "I'll heat more water. There's a basin behind the kitchen. Do you often take in strays like me?" she asked. "Not many," he admitted, a small smile touching his face. "But enough to know some folks need silence, some need questions, some need nothing more than a dry towel. You're the first kind." And for the first time, Clara believed it. Later, after soup and bread shared in companionable quiet, she rose to retire. At the hallway door, she turned back. "And what shall I call you, Thomas?" he replied simply. "And I'll call you Clara." That night, behind the closed door, she opened her valise. Inside lay not only dresses, but a faded Bible and a handkerchief embroidered with a purple flower from her girlhood. She placed it on the bedside table. The small bloom seemed to breathe again in the lamplight. For the first time in decades, Clara slept without dreams of running. Somewhere in the dark, she thought she felt a blanket pulled gently higher. Whether by wind or kindness, she could not tell. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the plains. Thomas stood in the yard tending his horses. He raised a hand in greeting, as though she had always belonged there. On the porch table, a cup of coffee steamed waiting for her. And as Clara wrapped her hands around it, gazing out at fields as wide as blank pages, she wondered perhaps there was still time to write a new beginning. Neither of them knew that one choice at a dusty gate would change the course of both their lives forever. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew-soaked hay and the low murmur of cattle beyond the barn. Clara stepped onto the porch, clutching her shawl around her shoulders. The wooden boards creaked under her feet, but it was a comforting sound, like a house speaking, not scolding. Below, Thomas moved with steady rhythm, tossing feed to his horses. His movements were practiced, not rushed, each gesture carrying the patience of a man who knew the land would never be tamed by haste. He looked up, met her gaze, and tipped his hat. "Coffee's strong this morning," he said. "I left a cup for you." Clara sat at the small porch table, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. Steam drifted against her face, and she closed her eyes for a moment. Coffee had always been bitter where she came from, burnt, hurried, served without care. But this was different, brewed, slow, measured. It tasted of steadiness. They spoke little as the sun lifted above the horizon. Silence wasn't empty here. It was full alive, like the pause between notes in a hymn. After breakfast, Thomas saddled his horse and looked toward her. "I'll be riding the north fence line. If you'd like to stretch your legs, the garden could use a pair of careful hands. But only if you wish. Nothing here is demanded of you." She almost laughed. Demanded. Her life had been nothing but demands. Marry this man, obey this rule, accept this insult. She wasn't used to an invitation that came without a price. "I'll tend the garden," she said, her voice soft, almost unsure. The hours passed with sun on her back and soil beneath her fingernails. She pulled weeds, straightened stakes, and brushed her palms over the leaves of tomato plants heavy with fruit. The work did not drain her. It steadied her heartbeat. In those furrows of dirt, she found echoes of the girl she once had been, the one who used to sing while planting flowers in her mother's yard before the world turned sharp. When Thomas returned at midday, he paused at the edge of the garden. "Looks like the plants already know your hands," he said. "They're forgiving," Clara answered, wiping her brow. "Plants don't keep records of your mistakes." He studied her for a moment. "Neither do I." The words struck deep. She looked away, pretending to adjust a vine, but her throat tightened. Kindness had always come with hooks-attached barbs that caught later. She didn't yet know if his would. That evening they shared supper again, a pot of stew, cornbread, and butter. Simple yet filled with an ease she hadn't known in years. He listened more than he spoke, letting her words stretch across the table without interruption. Finally, when the plates were cleared, Clara found herself speaking of the road that had brought her here, not every detail, but enough. The mail order ad, the letters exchanged, the promise of a man who never came, the folded note that cut like a blade. I was a fool to hope, she said, twisting the hem of her apron. No, said Thomas, firmly. Hope isn't foolish. What that man did was cruel. But hope is the bravest thing we've got. The room went quiet again, fire popping in the stove. She watched him, uncertain whether to believe such a claim. But the steady weight of his words lingered in her chest like a hand resting there, not to push, but to comfort. Before retiring, she asked the question that had hovered since yesterday. Why did you take me and Thomas? He didn't hesitate. Because no one deserves to be left at a gate. Her lips parted, but no words came. In that simple truth, something inside her shifted small, like the first crack of thaw in a frozen river. That night, she lay awake longer than before, staring at the ceiling beams. She thought of his eyes, honest, weathered, patient. And for the first time in many years, she wondered if perhaps her life was not finished with her after all. What Clara did not yet realize was that her arrival at Thomas's ranch was not an end, but the beginning of a story neither had dared to imagine. The days on Thomas's ranch began to fall into rhythm, though inside Clara the rhythm was broken steady one moment, stumbling the next. Outwardly, she tended the garden-mended linens and carried water like any ranch wife might, but inside old voices clawed at her. Too old, too heavy, too useless. Every weed she pulled seemed to whisper the words her first husband had spit at her. Every crack in the floorboards echoed the mockery of neighbors who said a widow had no worth but in serving another man. She fought against them, but some days they won. One morning Thomas found her standing in the yard staring at the gate where she had first arrived, the gate that had felt like judgment. You thinking of leaving? He asked gently, though there was no accusation in his tone. I don't know if I belong here, Clara admitted. Her hands twisted the fabric of her dress, her eyes fixed on the horizon. I was left behind once. Maybe I should have stayed behind. Thomas stepped closer, but not too close. Clara, you belong wherever your heart is allowed to rest. This land, this house, it's not a prison. You don't owe me anything. His words should have soothed her, but instead they stirred a storm. If he expected nothing, then what was she to him? If he gave her freedom, did it mean she could vanish without matter? That night she lay in bed and wept silently into her pillow. She wanted to believe his kindness, yet her scars told her all kindnesses carried debts. The struggle deepened days later when a letter arrived. Delivered by a dusty rider, the envelope bore the seal of her estranged brother. With trembling fingers she opened it. Inside were only a few lines sharp as knives. You have shamed us enough. Do not come back. Whatever home you once had is no longer yours. The paper fell from her hands. She sat on the porch steps, stunned, the wind tugging at her hair. She had not planned to return, but the finality cut deep. Even the pretense of family was now gone. When Thomas found her there, he didn't ask. He simply picked up the letter, read it, and then without a word tossed it into the stove, where it curled and burned to ash. She gasped. Why would you do that? Because their words don't get to decide your worth, he said, meeting her wide eyes. Not anymore. It should have been comforting, but instead it left her trembling. Her whole life had been built on the weight of others' judgments. Who was she without them? Could she really start anew at 50 when the world had already written her off? Her heart wrestled like a wild horse caught in a corral, longing to be free but afraid of what freedom would mean. The struggle lay not between her and Thomas, but within herself, between the woman she had been told she was and the woman she might yet be. That night, as the firelight flickered across the walls, she whispered into the silence of her room, "What if I'm not enough?" And though no one heard, the question lingered heavy in the air, waiting for an answer she could not yet give. As the ashes of her brother's letter cooled, Clara faced her deepest struggle, not whether Thomas would accept her, but whether she could accept herself. The morning broke wide in golden spilling light over the fields like forgiveness itself. But inside Clara, the storm from the night before still churned. She moved through the kitchen in silence, preparing biscuits and coffee with hands that felt like strangers to her. Thomas entered, quietly brushing dust from his hat. He watched her a long while before speaking. "You don't have to pretend you're all right," he said softly. Her back stiffened. Pretending had been her way of survival for decades. Pretending her first husband's cruelty was discipline. Pretending her neighbor's scorn didn't cut her. Pretending her family's silence wasn't rejection. She had carried the mask so long she hardly knew her own face beneath it. But when Thomas spoke those words, something inside cracked. She set the pan down, her hands trembling, and whispered, "I'm so tired, Thomas. Tired of holding everything in. Tired of never being enough." He didn't rush to her side or drown her in assurances. He simply sat at the table waiting, like a man who knew the earth yielded only when treated with patience. For the first time in years, Clara let the tears fall. Not hidden in the shadows of night, but here in the daylight before another human being. "They told me I was a punishment," she confessed, her voice ragged. "That my body was a burden, my years a shame, my heart unworthy of love. And I believed them. I believed them so deeply I forgot how to breathe without their voices telling me who I was." Thomas leaned forward, his rough hands folded on the table. "Clara, I don't see punishment when I look at you. I see a woman who survived every cruelty meant to break her. I see strength dressed in gentleness. And his voice caught quiet but steady, "I see the only person who's ever made this house feel alive." The words struck her like a bell, clear, resonant, breaking chains she hadn't realized were still wrapped around her. For a long moment she could only stare at him, her chest rising and falling with 1,000 unspoken emotions. And then something remarkable happened. She laughed. A small, shaky sound at first, then freer, lighter, as though the laughter itself was pulling stones from her chest. It wasn't joy, not yet. It was release. That afternoon, when the children from a nearby homestead came by asking for help, two thin-faced siblings, their clothes patched but their eyes bright, Clara surprised herself. Instead of shrinking into the shadows, she stepped forward. "Come in," she said warmly. "You must be hungry." She set food before them, kneeling to meet their gaze. The little girl clung to her sleeve. "Mama used to do that," she whispered. The word "mama" hit her like a soft arrow, piercing yet tender. Something in her chest swelled, not with sorrow, but with a fierce, protective warmth. For the first time, Clara felt she had more to give than she had ever been allowed to believe. That night, as the moon rose silver over the prairie, she stood at the window of her small room, watching the horizon. She realized she no longer wanted to run. The fear of rejection had lost its hold. For whether the world named her burden or blessing, she had begun to choose her own name. And with that choice came a quiet liberation. She touched the window pane, whispering into the night, "I am not useless. I am not too late. I am here. I am still here." From the hall, Thomas's voice came gently, as though he had heard her spirit speak. "And thank God for that, Clara." The chains that bound Clara's heart had begun to loosen. But freedom is a fragile thing. Could she truly trust it, or would the world's cruelty try to steal it back again? The prairie was at its most forgiving in spring. After months of biting winds and nights that made the bones ache, the earth softened again, coaxing buds from branches and grass from soil. For Clara, each day now carried a quiet rhythm she had not known in years, one that whispered of belonging. She rose early, not because duty demanded it, but because she wanted to greet the dawn. The sun painted gold across the wide horizon, and the kitchen filled with the smell of biscuits rising in the oven. She found herself humming as she worked small tunes from childhood she had long forgotten. When Thomas came in from the barn one morning, dust in his hair, he paused in the doorway. He watched her a moment, the way the light touched her face, softening lines carved by sorrow. She turned and caught his gaze. For once, instead of looking away, she held it. "What is it?" she asked softly. His voice was warm, steady. "Just realizing this house hasn't felt like a home in a long time, until now." Her breath caught, but this time it was not from fear. A fragile warmth spread through her chest like a seed daring to sprout. The children came often after that first visit, the thin boy and girl who had whispered, "Mama, please stay." They would bring eggs or sit by the fire while Clara read aloud from the old family Bible. Their presence filled corners of her heart she thought had been sealed shut forever. One evening, as the boy helped Thomas mend a fence, The girl tugged gently at Clara's sleeve. Do you think, she hesitated, voice small, do you think God sends us the people we need, even if they don't look like what we imagine? The question struck Clara deeply. For half a lifetime, she had believed God had forgotten her, that her years of rejection and abuse were some cruel verdict. Yet here in the unlikeliest place, she had been given a man who saw her scars not as shame, but as proof of survival. She squeezed the child's hand. Yes, sweetheart. I think sometimes he does exactly that. Still doubt lingered like a stubborn shadow. One afternoon, Clara visited town to trade flour for seed. As she walked through the general store, whispers followed her sharp as needles. There she is, that widow Brennan took in. Too old for a fresh start. Can't imagine what he sees in her. She's no spring chicken. She's just grateful someone took pity on her, I suppose. Their words pressed against her like old ghosts, and for a moment she faltered. She had lived under the weight of scorn too long not to feel its sting. But then she remembered the girl's whisper, Mama, please stay. She remembered Thomas's quiet words, You made this house alive again. And for the first time, the voices of others did not define her. She straightened her shoulders, purchased her goods, and walked out with dignity intact. That evening, she told Thomas what had happened. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening. When she finished, he said simply, Clara, I can't stop people from talking, but I can promise you this: what they say has no power over what I know to be true. And what do you know to be true? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. That you are the strongest woman I've ever known, he said. That this farm, this life, it's better because you're in it. And that if you choose to walk beside me, it won't be out of pity, but out of love. The word love hung in the air, trembling like a candle flame. She wanted to believe it. Oh, how she wanted to. But love in her past had meant chains, obedience, pain. Could she dare to trust it again here with him? Weeks passed and the land blossomed. The cattle grew fat, the fields green. With every season's change, Clara felt a change within herself. She laughed more freely, her hands steady as she cooked, her heart lighter as she walked the fence lines beside Thomas. One late afternoon, as they worked side by side stacking hay, she paused breathless, not from the labor, but from the sight before her. Thomas' sleeves rolled sunlight, catching the sweat on his brow, smiling at her with such unguarded warmth. She realized then that she was no longer afraid of love. It was not a thunderbolt, not a dramatic declaration. It was a slow unfolding, like a rose daring to open after frost. Love had crept in quietly through kindness. Shared burdens, lifted silences honored. She wiped her hands on her apron, her voice trembling, but clear. Thomas, I want you to know something. I've spent most of my life believing I wasn't worth much, believing that love was something meant for others, not for me. But being here with you, she swallowed hard, tears welling, I'm beginning to believe I was wrong. He dropped the hay fork, crossing the distance between them in 3 strides. His rough hand cupped her cheek gently. Clara, you were never wrong. You were lied to. And I mean to spend the rest of my life proving that to you, if you'll let me. Her tears fell freely now, but they were not born of sorrow. They were the tears of a woman who had been given back her own heart. She leaned into his touch, whispering, Then let's begin again. Not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as 2 souls who finally found each other. He kissed her, then not urgently, not demanding, but tenderly, like a promise. A kiss that said, You are safe now. You are chosen. You are home. That night, as they sat by the fire, the children asleep upstairs after supper, Clara rested her hand over Thomas's. The crackle of the wood filled the silence. I never thought I'd see hope again, she admitted. Hope's been waiting for you all along, he said quietly. Sometimes it just takes the right hands to light it again. She smiled through her tears. For the first time in 50 years, she felt not only hope but joy. The walls around Clara's heart had begun to crumble, replaced by something steadier, trust. But would this fragile hope endure when the world tested it again? The prairie looked calm that summer, but beneath its endless sky storms always gathered. And for Clara, the storm came not from nature, but from the past she thought she had left behind. One afternoon, a wagon rolled into the yard, its wheels creaking, its paint long faded. Thomas stepped outside, first cautious hand, resting at his side as if bracing for trouble. Clara, wiping flour from her hands, froze in the doorway when she saw who climbed down. It was her brother, older now, grayer but unmistakable. The same sharp eyes, the same mouth that had spoken words which cut deeper than any knife. "You're no good to anyone, Clara. You'll only bring shame." Her breath caught. The air felt thin. "Clara," he said almost casually, as if decades of silence hadn't passed. "I heard you'd landed here, with Brennan of all people." Thomas stepped closer, his presence steady, protective. "She's not landed here," he said firmly. "She's home." The word home nearly undid her, but her brother pressed on, his tone bitter. "Our family's been struggling. The ranch is failing. Thought you might do something useful for once, maybe convince Brennan here to help." The old wound reopened at once. Useless. Burden. The same refrain she had lived under for half a century. For a moment she faltered. The old Clara, the one who bowed her head, swallowed, her voice almost answered. But then she felt Thomas's hand graze hers, quiet strength in the touch. She straightened. Her voice trembled, but it held. "All my life you told me I was nothing, that I owed you everything. But I've learned something here. Family isn't made of blood, it's made of love and respect. And I won't trade this life or this man for the scraps of your approval." Her brother's face hardened, the old contempt rising. "So you'll turn your back on us?" "I'm not turning my back," she said, steady now. "You turned yours long ago. I'm just choosing not to chase after it anymore." That night, the silence between her and Thomas was not heavy. It was sacred. After the children had gone to bed, she sat by the fire, her hands trembling from the confrontation. "I don't know if I was strong," she whispered. "You were stronger than anyone I've ever known," Thomas said quietly. "You broke the chains they tried to keep around you. Clara, I need you to know, whatever shadows come from your past, you'll never face them alone again." She looked at him, firelight flickering across his steady eyes. For the first time in her life, she realized she wasn't standing alone in the storm. Yet the town wasn't done testing her. When word spread of her brother's visit, whispers began again. At church, she felt them, the sideways glances, the muttered questions. What kind of woman turns away her own kin? What must Brennan see in her? The weight of it pressed on her chest. And one Sunday evening, she almost told Thomas she should leave, that she didn't want to tarnish his good name. But before she could speak, he took her hand in front of everyone as they walked out of the church. Heads turned, whispers rose, but Thomas didn't flinch. When they reached the wagon, he looked at her with quiet conviction. "Let them talk. I know the truth of you. That's all that matters." Her throat tightened. In that simple act, choosing her openly without hesitation, he silenced every cruel voice that had ever haunted her. The true test, however, came one stormy night in late summer. Lightning split the sky as rain lashed against the roof. One of the children woke crying, afraid of the thunder. Clara gathered the girl into her arms, rocking her gently by the fire. "You're safe," she whispered, pressing her cheek to the child's hair. "No storm lasts forever." As she spoke, she realized she wasn't only comforting the child, she was speaking to the frightened woman she herself had been for so long. When Thomas came in from securing the barn, soaked and shivering, he stopped at the doorway. He watched her with the child in her arms, her face serene despite the storm outside. And in that moment, both of them knew the truth. She was no longer the widow mocked as useless. She was the heart of this home. The next morning, when the storm had passed, Clara stepped outside. The earth smelled fresh, cleansed. She lifted her face to the sun, tears of release streaking her cheeks. The years of silence, rejection, and fear no longer defined her. She was no longer the woman cast aside. She was the woman who stayed, who built, who loved. Thomas came beside her, resting his hand gently over hers. "Clara," he said, voice low, "we've weathered the worst of it. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." And for the first time in 50 years, she believed it, not just in him, but in herself. The storm had tested their bond, and the whispers had tried to break her spirit, but Clara had stood tall. Now, with love no longer a fragile hope, but a living truth, one question remained. Could she finally let herself embrace the joy she had been denied all her life? The first light of autumn crept across the horizon, soft gold spilling over the plains. The air carried a crispness, the kind that hinted at harvest and change. For Clara, it felt like more than a season shifting. It was her life quietly turning towards something she had once thought was beyond her reach. That morning, as she moved about the kitchen, the children giggled by the hearth, their small hands sorting apples into baskets. Thomas came in from the barn, his boots damp with dew, a basket of eggs balanced easily in his arms. He caught Clara's gaze and smiled a smile that said more than words ever could. She wasn't a guest here. She wasn't a burden. She was the very center of it all. Later that week, the town gathered for the harvest fair. Music floated through the air, fiddles and laughter mixing with the smell of roasted corn. For years, Clara had dreaded such gatherings, always aware of the whispers, always shrinking into corners. But this time was different. Thomas held her hand as they walked through the fairground. The children tugged at her skirts proudly, showing her ribbons and sweets. Neighbors greeted them with nods, some surprised, some reluctant, but many warm. The whispers still existed, but they no longer pierced her. They drifted off like dry leaves in the wind. When the music started, Thomas turned to her, his eyes steady. "May I?" he asked, offering his hand. Her breath caught. She hadn't danced in decades, but the steadiness of his hand was an anchor, and the warmth of his gaze was a promise. Slowly she nodded, and there beneath the lantern glow, Clara danced. Her steps were uncertain at first, but Thomas guided her gently, never rushing, never letting go. The children clapped, laughter filled the air, and for the first time in her 50 years, she felt weightless, free of shame, free of fear, free to be seen. As the music faded, Thomas leaned close, his voice low enough only for her. "Clara, I don't want to just walk beside you. I want to grow old with you. Will you let me?" Her eyes brimmed, but her voice was sure. "Yes, Thomas. 1,000 times yes." The crowd had no idea what passed between them in that quiet moment, but to Clara it was everything. Not a grand spectacle, not a fairy tale, but something truer, a love built on kindness, patience, and choice. Seasons passed. Winter brought quiet evenings by the fire, spring brought blossoms and fresh hope. With each day, Clara found herself not merely surviving, but flourishing. She managed the home with confidence, taught the children with patience, and stood at Thomas's side with pride. One evening years later, she sat on the porch watching the children, no longer so little, running across the pasture. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of fire and rose. Thomas came out, sitting beside her, slipping his hand into hers. "Do you ever think about the past?" he asked softly. She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I do, but I don't live there anymore. For so long I thought I was useless, that my story had already ended. But you, this life, you showed me that hope doesn't run out with age. It waits. Sometimes a lifetime, but it waits." Thomas pressed her hand gently, and now it's ours. Together they sat in silence, watching the horizon. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer hurt. They had become part of her strength. For Clara, love had not come in youth, nor with fanfare. It had come quietly, steadily, like the dawn arriving late, but beautiful all the same. Her story was not one of fairy tale rescue, but of endurance, dignity, and love that bloomed against all odds. For anyone who has ever been told they were too late, too old, or too broken, Clara's life whispered another truth. It is never too late to be chosen and to choose love in return. In the end, what mattered was not the gate where she had been abandoned, but the doorway where she was welcomed. Clara discovered that love does not always arrive in youth wrapped in roses and promises. It sometimes comes later, quieter but deeper. And Thomas, by simply choosing kindness over indifference, showed that true strength in the West was never about the size of one's ranch, but the size of one's heart. Their story reminds us that no matter how many times life has told us you are not enough, there can still be someone who looks at us and says, "You are exactly what I need." For those who feel worn down by rejection, remember it is never too late to find a place where you are valued, respected, and loved for who you truly are. Here in these Wild West tales, we don't just witness cowboys and widows, we see reflections of ourselves, our scars, and our hope. If this story touched you, I invite you to stay with our growing family here at None. Wild West Saga. Subscribe, share it with a friend who needs encouragement, and leave a comment below. Tell us, would you like to see the next part of Clara and Thomas's journey, or hear more stories of late blooming love, resilience, and healing from the frontier? Your voice matters here just as much as theirs did in the story.